Thanks so much for the warm welcome. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here this morning. And I just want to start by offering a big thank you to Claudia and Piers and the Asia research team for having me today. I think you're actually in for a pretty interesting morning because I was talking to some of the other speakers and it seems like we're all kind of aligned on some things, but there are definitely differing opinions on millennials and behaviors and things like that. So I hope I get a chance to potentially respond to some of the disagreements that might come up later on. But I think maybe where I just want to quickly start is if you're not familiar with YouGov, we're probably a little bit more well-known in the UK and the US than we are in Asia-Pac, but we are kind of expanding our presence. We're a global technology-driven consumer insights company. We're only about 17 years old, so we started as an early player in the online polling space. Despite what our name might suggest, we're not just government polling. We still do a lot of political polling, but that's actually contained only about 5% of what we do now. So most of it is private sector and kind of consumer-focused research. So what are we going to do today? I want to talk to you about a couple of different things. I want to talk a little bit about the state of online research today. It's in a bit of kind of, I wouldn't say a crisis, but there's some interesting things that have been happening over the last, I'd say 2 years or even 1 year that has really kind of called into question the accuracy of kind of online methods. So I want to talk a bit about that. I want to talk about the UK general election because we did something a little bit different with that kind of deserves to be kind of discussed a bit. I want to talk about what we learned from the UK election, applying basically our new model to polling. And then actually I want to end today with a look at youth in Singapore. So applying some of the kind of learnings from MRRP and looking at kind of some pretty fresh data about millennials or younger demographics in Singapore. So just to kind of start, the state of research today, the online research industry has a trust problem, and this is very prevalent to people like myself because we see a lot of this coming up in the news, but we're also talking to clients every single day where these questions kind of come up, saying things like, well, how accurate are online polls? And there were a couple of big events that really kind of established this narrative around accuracy. So obviously these two big things, they were kind of big upsets. So the Brexit leave vote, despite that there were some early signals that a leave vote was actually going to happen, a lot of the polls were calling it as a stay, and no one really figured that Trump was going to be president of the US until the day it actually happened. So again, the online polling space really called or got behind both of these events in the way that they didn't kind of actually turn out. And again, if you specifically look at 2016, there's been a lot of interesting kind of dialogue, specifically, I think, driven by the journals that typically kind of get behind polls, or even just drawing on polls to talk. We work a lot with journalists that take our kind of data that we produce and then put it out there. So there's an important kind of relationship between the data provider and journalists that are getting in front of that data. And I think these kind of events have really called them to kind of question how accurate online polling can be. But the thing that we have to keep in mind is that we've actually been here before. So how many people are familiar with this image? Show of hands. Don't be shy. One person? So this is a picture of Harry Truman on voting day in 1948. And if you can't see the newspaper he's holding up, it says, "Dewey defeats Truman," which Truman won the election. So what happened was Truman's election was actually a big upset. All the polls were showing that his competitor, Thomas Dewey, was actually going to win the election. And the world was very different. The polling landscape was a lot different in terms of how they conduct election polls. And obviously the print landscape was very different. They have to actually go and print, carve out the boilerplates and print the newspaper hours before. And it wasn't until like the second or third star editions that they actually corrected the paper. But what happened was the Chicago Tribune had run this story in the early, when the East Coast hadn't finished polling, and the early signs showed that Dewey was actually going to win. And things really changed over the course of the evening. So they ran the paper, and this is Truman kind of gleefully holding up the paper that says, "Dewey defeats Truman." So again, the polling landscape and the research landscape was very different back then, but we've seen this kind of thing happen before. And I just want to take a little small moment to talk about the difference between traditional polling methods and kind of the newer types of polling. So if you're familiar with these two kind of frames, so probability polling is basically where is random sampling, where everyone in the population has a chance to participate in the survey. Non-probability sampling is basically where you use different methods, such as advertisements or recruiting people into a panel to then poll that audience. And the challenge with that is particularly or the challenge that people have put forth, is that with online polling methods or river sampling, not everyone in the population has the chance to participate. And especially with online, the biggest factor is online penetration. So when you focus on online data collection methods, there are parts of the population that don't have access to the internet, and therefore you cannot generate a true generalization about the population. So the thing about non-probability samples is you have to be careful because they actually factor in a lot of different things. Online panels is probably the most sophisticated form of it, but it also factors in things like river sampling, which can be very, very inaccurate. So this is a really interesting study that Pew undertook in 2016, and they given that there was a lot of narrative around the accuracy of polls, they decided that they wanted to kind of explore whether non-probability samples are actually accurate. And actually, I recommend that you click that link and follow the report. What they did was they took a US Census, and they gave the US Census survey to 9 different panel vendors and got them to run the exact same survey. And they also used the census data as the benchmark because census is, it's like 95% of the population completed. So it's a really good kind of way to actually create a benchmark. And what they did was they sent the questionnaire to 9 different vendors, YouGov included, and they basically measured the potential bias and the accuracy compared to the census. And I is actually YouGov. So YouGov performed well in this. But the outcome of this paper was very, very interesting because it wasn't, in answering the question, how accurate are online polls, it wasn't that yes or no they are. It actually, their outcome was, it depends. And the reason it depends is because this is one of the takeouts of the paper. Online non-probability surveys are not monolithic, and that means that the problem is there is no standard approach in the industry to applying weighting and to building weighting schemas and building out generalizing a sample. So they found that there was massive variance between all the different vendors. Some of the vendors performed very well in terms of limiting the bias and being very, very close to the census data, and others didn't. So again, the finding was the accuracy really depends on how rigorously the online panel vendor actually weights and processes the data. So I want to segue now and talk a little bit about the election. So if you're not familiar with the UK election, it's a very interesting kind of set of situations. So basically, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, had a challenge on her hand, particularly with managing the Brexit kind of transition. And there wasn't an election due in the UK until 2020. But she actually, the irony of this whole situation is that she was relying somewhat on polling data that was telling her that if she called a snap election, she could potentially move her Senate position from a minority government to majority, so get more conservative votes. And at that point, the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn were not polling well in the national polls at all, and everything was pointing towards if she called a snap election, she'd be able to get a better position in the House by getting more seats. Now, if you understand what happened with the election, it didn't go that way. It did not work out well for Theresa May. And what we did was we applied a different technique, which we've actually called MRP, or Multilevel Regression and Post-stratification. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this is and what it is in a few minutes. The first thing is MRP is actually a model. It's not like a polling methodology. So what it does is it takes polling data and models it out. And it gets, I'll talk again a little bit in more detail about what it is. But the MRP model has performed really well. But so well that we called the hung election 3 weeks before voting day. And it was really interesting because the 3 weeks for YouGov was really, really tense. So, because again, even 3 weeks out from the election, all the polls were showing that Theresa May was on a path to get a majority government. We released a couple of press releases on our results, and the backlash was very, very swift. So very quickly we had the Times, the Guardian, all the way down to kind of local trades talking about YouGov's wrong, they're insane, nothing is pointing in this direction. And even that article on the far right was written by someone named Michael Mazinski, who's this gentleman on the far right. And this is a really interesting video to watch because on the left is Joe Twyman, who's our head of political science. And on the right is Michael Mazinski, who leads an ad agency. And this was a really heated debate. He was saying not only is YouGov wrong, but they're irresponsible for putting out kind of a new methodology that's clearly wrong and is having an impact on the currency, on different things. So I sympathize with Michael because he didn't, one thing we didn't put out early or at this point was a lot of information about the methodology. We just put out the prediction and a lot of people were upset about it. But voting day happened, and a lot of different things kind of came to light. So number one, we called the election, but it wasn't a binary prediction. It wasn't, we're going to call it yes or no on a conservative loss or loss of seats. When you look at the actual individual constituencies, we got 95% of them right, or I should say that MRP got 95% of them right. And again, we had some. It was a very tense 3 weeks from the point that we put that call out. So it was a nice kind of indication, but also the response was quite good. So that's a tweet from Nate Silver saying the only thing I can kind of make sense of is from this whole thing is YouGov's model. And the one on the bottom is Michael Mazinski, who went on Sky News and had a very heated debate with our head of political, Joe Twyman, saying, listen, congrats guys, you guys did a good job. So, but what is MRP? So again, I've already talked about the fact that it's not a polling methodology, it's more of it's a model that relies on polling data. The easiest way to describe it is it's a top-down approach to weight. It's a bottom-up approach to weighting. So in the polling industry, what you would usually do is you would take a small number of interviews or conduct a small number of interviews. So n equals 800 or 1,000 or 1,200. And then you would take a sampling frame, which is usually based on age and gender. So the fallout of the national kind of demographics based on this percent age, this percent male and female and different age breaks. And you would then take that national picture and try and account for local voting constituencies and weight it according to kind of local voting behaviors. What MRP does is it flips the model. It actually starts with the micro geographies. So it looks at voting constituencies and builds a national picture up from there. In addition to that, it also does a couple of other things. It factors in historical data. So the MRP model was actually looking at the history of civic engagement at individual voting constituencies. So what did we learn from the model? A couple of really interesting things kind of came out of MRP and just the kind of the outcome of the UK election. The first thing is that socioeconomic class is no longer a strong indicator of voting intention in the UK. So again, just keep in mind that I'm talking about UK for now, and we'll get past that in a few minutes. But if you go back many, many years, so if you're not familiar with the social grades or the class grades in the UK, the ABC one is generally the abstraction for, I think that's middle class, and C2D is the working class. And again, traditionally, if you looked at voting intentions in these different class groups, you saw big differences between generally the middle class were usually voting Labour or and the working class voting Conservative. This is the result of the latest election. Again, it's basically right down the line. So class is no longer a strong indicator of voting intention or political ideology, I should say. Age is the new predictor of voting intention. I think this is going to be an interesting thing for some of the future talks. But this is really, really fascinating. Because this is something that has really changed over the last couple of years. So if you look at, especially, so the blue bars are the people who voted Conservative. The red are people who voted Labour. And you can see that there is a very, very clear correlation between age and ideology. Now, there's a couple of things that are interesting here because this doesn't mean that these groups are going to carry forward. So the 20s, we do know that people change their voting intentions as they get older. So they might switch from, in some cases, from Labour to Conservative or vice versa. But this is really changing the layout of what we used to think we knew about how people vote. So age is the #1 predictor of voting turnout in the UK right now. Alongside age, education has become a really important demographic line. So again, if you look at a correlation between education levels, so people that have a university degree, a higher level uni degree, there's a higher likelihood that they're going to vote liberal, so center-right, center-left or left, and less likely that they're going to vote conservative in the UK. And the last thing is that beyond demographics, our data also shows a wide variation in voting behaviors depending on the newspapers that people read. And this, to me, is the most interesting part of this, because you've seen the news media in the UK and the US and other places around the world become a lot more polarized in some cases. They take very strong positions on political figures, and also things like social media have been known to, or it's been discussed that they create these kind of ideological echo chambers. And I actually have a hypothesis that is not supported by YouGov, that social media is a big part of this move towards age, and that being a driver of ideological intention. Because, again, you've kind of heard these stories about people who voted for Trump being like, well, my whole Facebook feed was just people talking about how they supported Trump, and vice versa. And again, I think platforms like Facebook kind of have a tendency to reinforce those ideologies. So what are some of the key takeaways from MRP? So the thing about MRP is it's a complex model, and it can take actually a lot of data to build it up. And this is not necessarily something that's going to be even cost-effective for brands to apply at kind of just a polling or segmentation level. But there are some kind of important takeaways, I think, from the learnings of MRP and the UK election that I think all brands that are investing in research, quant or qual, should always be kind of keeping in mind. So the first point is weighting is very important. So your sampling frames and where your sample comes from is very important. So I'm not just trying to chalk up YouGov or panel providers, but there are a lot of different ways that you can get data right now, or opinion data. So a lot of, like Twitter, for example, was really experimenting with ad units that allowed you to basically river sample. And it was nice because you could just do a quick poll and get lots of quick data. But there was no control for how representative your sample would be of the larger population. It's really hard for you to understand whether your data set is actually highly skewed towards male or towards conservative or towards some other kind of variable. Google Surveys is another platform I'm really interested in. In some ways, I think Google Surveys platform is very innovative and very forward-thinking, but it's also very risky. If you're not familiar with what Google Surveys does, is they do have a panel, but another way that they sample is by giving you free articles on paywalled news sites like the New York Times in exchange for your opinion. So what happens is, if you go to a site where you've gone through your free article limit, what Google will do is they have integrations with these media publishers to say, oh, well, you usually have to pay a subscription, but if you fill out this 3-question survey, we'll give you one more article for free. Again, really forward-thinking, and in some cases that works really well. But you have to be very careful, because when it comes to news media is really becoming entrenched in some cases. You don't have as many news media that are as kind of ideologically unbiased, or rooted in one ideology more than another. So you have to be careful with those kind of new approaches to be able to river sampling or to getting quick samples, because the weighting and how well you can generalize that sample to a larger population is really, really, really important. Knowing the limits of your data is also important. So that sometimes we've seen clients that have really outdated data sets, like segmentations from a couple years ago that just are not applicable anymore. Or that what they do is they have a tendency to overgeneralize the data set. So they'll look at a particular variable and just look at age and assume that everyone within that age bracket assumes these observed behaviors. So you have to understand the limits of your data set. And this is a big thing for us. YouGov is very honest to some of our clients when it comes to areas where online penetration is a lot lower, because our panels, being online, tend not to be very strong in areas when you get where internet penetration is lower. So when you talk about, tier 4 cities in India or China, we have to have very frank conversations with our clients about our ability to generate a national portrait of a consumer base in those kind of regions. And again, that's a limitation of data that sometimes people are not very honest about. They will do a quick poll. That poll could be highly rigged to a really urban or socioeconomic region, or type of a region, and then they generalize that for an entire country like India or China, and that's very, very dangerous. Consider changes in behavior over time. Another thing that we notice is that clients will take a segmentation, a point-in-time segmentation. They'll do it once because segmentations traditionally are very expensive and they're big, heavy kind of projects, and they do it, and then they just kind of use that data for years, and they use that to generalize about millennials and about youth demographics and different segments. But you'll actually, what MRP did really well was it figured out how to kind of factor in historical changes in voting behavior or civic engagement or education, changes in attitudes and things like that. So I'm looking for ways to actually look at changes in behavior over time is actually, can help you get a better understanding of where your customers are going. Collecting data more frequently is something that we've seen a lot in the research space. So clients, again, they tend to be moving away from the kind of big whopper studies and moving more into doing lighter weight kind of micro studies. I've already mentioned some of these. The last one I want to mention before I show you a couple of quick things from Singapore is don't just focus on media behavior. I see a lot of clients that tend to focus on how many people are using Facebook or how often they use their mobile phone and things like that. You'll learn a lot more about your customers and specifically younger demographics if you look at other things aside from just media behavior and what channels they're on. If you look at things like their wants and needs and frustrations. And with that, the last thing I wanted to do today was kind of just show you a look at youth, not millennials, in Singapore. And this is data actually that comes from our platform called Profiles. And Profiles is basically a database that every single day we send out kind of various surveys that populate profiles. It's just basically a place where you can go and kind of build segments or profiles from scratch. So the data is generally updated between every 3 months to a year. The reason for the wide range is demographic variables. You don't have to update that often, but attitudinal variables you do have to update more often. And my last point about just not focusing on media behavior, I thought it'd be a bit fun to show you some of the more attitudinal data points that we have in our profiles database. So this is only Singapore, because again, this changes drastically when you look across different countries. So all we're doing is looking at Singapore, and this is data that was pulled just a couple of days ago. So when we asked our panelists some kind of attitudinal statements, and again, these were Likert questions. They were asked to rate their level of agreeness, definitely agree, somewhat agree, neutral, etc. And I've only plotted the extreme points here. So the definitely agrees and the definitely disagrees. So the first one is, I couldn't get through the day without my mobile communication. And what you're seeing here are the age breaks in 5-year intervals or 4-year intervals from 15 all the way down to 65 plus. You can see a very strong correlation between people that are highly dependent on their mobile phones at a younger age, but it tends to kind of go down as they get a bit older. I'm not afraid of change. Very interesting question. And again, if you look at the green line there, this is showing the percentage of people that definitely agree. So when you're young, you're bold and the world is in front of you, and you're not afraid of change, and that goes up. But then when you kind of get to your 30s and you're building a family and you're at the top of your or you're at a really important stage in your career, it actually starts to dip again. People are less likely to agree with that, but then it goes back up again when you go into retirement at around 50 plus. I'm happy with my standard of living. This is a really interesting question because if you correlate it with things like people who exercise and people who put family over money, they tend to have higher ratings for happiness. People that focus more on money tend to rate lower in terms of saying that they're happy with their standard of living. But again, if you're just looking at how this falls out across age breaks, again, the younger demos, very, very happy with their standard of living. Then they get out into university and then they get a job and it just goes all downhill from there. But then when they get to retirement, they tend to get pretty happy again. I'm motivated by career progression, more by career progression than money. So this is very interesting. Again, you see at the beginning, it kind of spikes up, especially when they leave university in their 20s and they go to school. They're very, very motivated by driving, by their career progression, and not necessarily by money, but potentially by skill sets and moving up the corporate ladder. And then once they get to the end of their 30s and above, it doesn't really matter anymore. They're focused more on their family. I've got 2 kids now. I don't care about work anymore. It's all about it's all about my kids. I don't really care what other people think about me. This one's really interesting. So again, it has a bit of a spike in the beginning, but as you kind of get older, people tend to care less about what others think of you. Couple more, I'll just do a couple of these. Again, these were just kind of interesting things I pulled out of our profiles database that I thought were interesting. This is actually social network membership, declared social network membership in Singapore I pulled out 3, so Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. Because there's a lot of talk about, activity on Facebook and is Facebook dying, things like that. The first thing is, you can see that Facebook is kind of the everyone platform. So it's in the 80 percentile in terms of usage or membership across the board. But then when you look at Snapchat, Snapchat actually, obviously we all complain about Snapchat being unusable for older demos, or at least I do. But Snapchat has a big generational problem. And Instagram has really crept in with their introduction of stories and basically going right after Snapchat. I think Snapchat's in a lot of trouble. Because also these things, in terms of adoption and usage, change rapidly. And I think this is an important point, is that you can't do a segmentation, find out your youth customers are on Facebook and just lock that in for years. You need to have your kind of pulse on how this is changing. Tumblr is one I didn't put on here, but Tumblr is in big trouble. So penetration is only around 15%. It's not particularly higher among youth, and people are just giving up on the platform. So it's really interesting to see how these kind of lines are changing. This one is where do people get their news. These are smaller age breaks now, so it's only, instead of the 4-year intervals, I've got bigger ranges. But you can see that on the one, the middle one, that younger demos between 16 to 29 are much statistically more likely to get their news from social media. So remember the echo chamber point I made before? It's very interesting to see that social media is becoming serving the primary place where people are going to get their news. I'm going to move past a couple of these on to advertising. So these are a couple of attitudinal statements on advertising. So this question asked, I think ads are just a waste of my time. Again, the younger demos, 16 to 29, are statistically more likely to either definitely agree or tend to agree. But I enjoy watching ads with my favorite celebrities. Again, the 16 to 29 are statistically more likely to agree with this. So again, when it comes to advertising, celebrity involvement, celebrity endorsements do actually work, despite what you might see a lot of kind of discussion around influencers and KOLs. I think it depends on the execution and the quality. I expect ads to entertain me. Again, 16 to 29, statistically more likely to definitely agree. So there's an expectation that ads should have some kind of entertainment value to them. This one is actually interesting because you just assume that online is the place to be for younger demos. But look at that one. In Singapore, cinema. So this question was, which channels are most likely to catch your attention? Cinema actually statistically ranks much higher among younger demographics. So another takeaway from this is don't just think digital. Like, it's not just, obviously you need to be thinking about offline to online, online to offline, and omni-channel. But you need to kind of, you can't just double down on social media and digital, because there are some really interesting things happening here. So that's it. Again, I want to thank Asia Research for having me today. I hope some of that data was interesting for you. And I think there's going to be a Q&A after the next talk. So if you have any questions, just hold them for now, and we'll be happy to talk to you later on.